Hello and welcome to Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online. My name is Kelly and I'm a former wedding planner and blogger, and I'm obsessed with weddings. If you're planning a wedding in Ireland, you're in the right place. You're going to learn the tried and tested methods to planning your dream wedding without the added stress. Think of this as your one-stop shop for everything to do with planning your wedding in Ireland, with me, your new wedding planning bestie, and a cup of tea. This is Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online. I get it. Weddings are expensive, but how on earth can you make your wedding be affordable without coming across as kind of cheap? I'm going to walk you through all of that today. My name is Kelly and I'm the host of the Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online podcast, and today we're talking all about how to plan an affordable wedding that doesn't look or feel cheap. This is what makes a wedding feel cheap. When you're trying to replicate something big and extravagant, but you're making cheap swaps. So today I'm going to walk you through a few different categories, and I'm going to tell you some ways that people have tried to make cheap swaps that just didn't work. But I'm going to give you some suggestions and ideas of things you could do instead. And we're going to start with the big guest list. Now, what doesn't work is if you want to invite loads and loads of people to your wedding, but if you can't afford to host all of them, but then you just kind of do everything on the cheap, it just doesn't really work. I've been to weddings like that before where it was clear that the couple wanted to have, 100, 150 or 200 guests at their wedding and they couldn't afford it. So instead of cutting down the guest list, they just did everything they would normally do, but everything was cheap. And of course, you're there to celebrate someone's love and you're not going to be focusing on those things. But as a couple hosting people, you want to host them in the best way you can. And so here are a few things that you can do if you want to have your big guest list and at this point in time, you just can't afford it. Option number one, you could just cut down your guest list. I know it sounds easier than it actually is, but if you have fewer guests, you can then get a smaller venue. You can pay less on anything that is a cost per head. So things like your food, your drinks, your cutlery, glassware, wedding favors, anything that you're paying a price per person immediately gets cut down by just cutting down your guest list. And you could just be super vigilant about it and then cut out whole groups of people. For example, no children, or no plus ones, or no work friends, or whatever it is. If it's a whole group of people, it's so much easier. Option number two, you can invite everyone you want to have to your ceremony, have a little celebration after that still feels fun. So my husband and I did that. We had 250 people at our ceremony and we had an epic wedding cake table. We did a few speeches as well, and we wanted everyone who was there to feel like they were actually part of the celebration. And then we had a bit of an after party at a different venue with 100 and I think it was 110 people, and that was the dinner and the dancing and everything. And so we more than halved our guest list for the kind of party, the expensive bit. So it's easy to do something like that if you have two different locations. And I will tell you a little bit later on the options between two locations and one location in terms of affordability. And right now, if you have two locations, it means you can have everyone you want at your ceremony venue, have a bit of a celebration afterwards, and then have a smaller guest list at your reception venue. And you could do it even in a more dramatic way than my husband and I did. You could have 250 people at your ceremony, and then you could whittle it down to 40 people for a dinner afterwards. Whatever you do, you just want your first group of people to feel like they're actually part of the celebration and not, you don't just want to have them in and send them out, but have some food or drinks or something together afterwards so that they feel like they're part of celebrating and not just, sitting down, watching you get married and then waving you off goodbye. Another option is to actually get married at a later date. So if your big guest list at the party is actually a big priority for you, I completely understand that. Then what you need to do is actually delay your wedding. If you haven't put down a deposit for your venue, if you haven't started booking suppliers yet, you can actually delay the date and you can save up more money, make a plan to actually be able to afford to have all the people there that you want to have and give them the party that you want to give them. So those are your three options when it comes to the big guest list. Either cut your guest list in half or more. You can invite everyone to your ceremony and have a smaller party afterwards, or you can just delay the wedding. If the guest list is your priority, those are your options. Okay, next category is the epic meal. Okay, let's say you really want to prioritize food, but you can't afford that 4-course Michelin star meal. This is what happens. Sometimes couples are really tempted to either DIY all the food which I don't recommend unless you and your family are, caterers by profession and you understand the ins and outs of food safety and keeping everything at the right temperature and storing everything correctly, knowing when to prepare everything without, of course, adding all the stress onto you to cook food the day of or the day before your wedding. The other option is, couples can choose smaller meals or cheaper cuts of meat, and it just ends up feeling cheap if you do either of those options and you don't know how to do them well. Of course, if you are caterers, it's a different story, but the average couple is not. So here are some options of what you could do if you want to have an epic meal, but you don't know how to afford it. Option 1, get married at a non-meal time. So you can still have really awesome food if it's not like dinner time. So let's say you are tying the knot at like 5 p.m. Your guests are probably going to be seated in the reception hall at like 7, 7:30. And then, of course, they're going to expect a full meal. And rightly so, because it's a meal time. And then you have to feed them. And then you can't just do it on the cheap. But if you had to host a non-mealtime meal, like desserts and cocktails, and you get married earlier, you finish the party earlier, and it's not overlapping with the mealtime, then it's acceptable to go big on desserts. And then you're not spending money on cuts of meat and that kind of thing. But it's like dessert buffets and that sort of thing. And you can still have some savory options and different things, but the main thing is not a seated, plated meal. The other option is to have something like a brunch wedding, where it's still a mealtime, but it's an unconventional mealtime to get married at. So you have an earlier wedding, say like 9 or 10 a.m. You then have your brunch meal. And with a brunch meal, you typically serve less food because people eat less at that time of the day than they would in the evening. So you could still have your Prosecco, you could have mimosas and that kind of thing, but ultimately you'd be spending less on alcohol because people drink less in the morning than they do in the evenings. People have less food in the day, so you'd be serving less courses, and you can get more creative with what you're serving, like waffle bars and pancake bars and that kind of thing. So a brunch menu is a really fun way to save money on your food while still presenting something really fun and high quality to your guests. Another option is to bulk up your meal with an amazing breadboard. So instead of canapes where you're paying per head and they're really intricate, they're like detailed canapes and sometimes expensive per head, if you had to opt for the breadboard option, discuss with your venue and caterers if that is more affordable to have a big breadboard instead of the canapes, and maybe even instead of a starter. The breadboard could serve as both canapes, starter, and a breadboard. See what I'm doing there? How about this? Serve your wedding cake as dessert. So instead of having your dessert and then a wedding cake, serve the wedding cake as dessert. So using two things for one purpose is a great way to save money. And when it comes to your food, people generally don't need to have both the dessert and the cake. So why not use one for both? If you are actually a really big sweets fan, you could have a sweets table or a candy buffet or something like that, but it can also double as your wedding favor. So you're saving money when it comes to your wedding meal experience by doubling up, again, two things for one purpose. Okay, how about this? When it comes to your drinks, how can you save money? And now I know it's an Irish wedding. Drinking is part of the Irish wedding experience. You can't just cut out the alcohol unless you're strategically and deliberately hosting a dry wedding, which of course, go for it. If that's what you're doing, do it. But if you are having drinks, here are a few things that you can do. You might be tempted to say, we're just going to go for the cash bar and guests are going to pay for everything. And that can come across as a little cheap and stingy. So this is what you can do instead. You can choose which drinks are served at the bar. And so if you're having an open bar, you could say guests can have these drinks and we'll pay for them. And if they want anything else, they can pay for themselves. And then you can choose things like, house wine, and you can have certain spirits that you have available. And then you just choose what is used and what you're paying for and what your guests are going to pay for if they really, really want a certain option. Another option is to have an open bar, but only for a set amount of time. And so once that time elapses, the drinks are still there and guests are invited to purchase their own. You could also ditch the Prosecco toast. So instead of all your guests being given a glass of Prosecco or champagne or whatever it is, they can toast with what they have, what they're already drinking. You'd find loads of people don't even like Prosecco, and it ends up being a waste. And if people are only having it for the toast, it's literally a full glass that's being poured for them, and they're having a couple of sips across the speeches. So actually allowing them to sip on what they're already drinking means you're not paying for the Prosecco that no one's going to drink. And finally, you could be really strategic, get your staff to pour the drinks. That way, instead of putting bottles of drinks on the tables and then hoping that people like all the options and that they drink them all, you may end up with like 10 to 20 bottles of, little bits of wine left over here and there. Whereas if the staff will pour the drinks, they can walk around, and when it's requested, they top up drinks, and then it's their bottle that they're moving around instead of a bottle seated on a table. So that's what you can do with your wedding drinks. When it comes to the most fun party ever, this is the temptation. Get a Spotify playlist or make a Spotify playlist, find a sound system, plug a phone or a laptop in, and you're good to go. Firstly, if you don't have the paid Spotify, you're going to be interrupted with ads every 30 minutes. Believe me, I've experienced that before, and it's not fun. And even if you do have the paid Spotify, it comes across as really cheap if that's the way that you're entertaining your guests. The risks are not worth it. I mentioned the ads. That's a risk that you can anticipate. But if somebody sees the laptop and it's not being manned by anybody, like a professional DJ, and it's just some friend of yours, anyone can come across and just change the song. I've been to a wedding where they did that, and it would be really awkward. It's, halfway through a song, someone's like, I'd rather listen to this one, and then they go and play it. At any normal wedding, people go up to the DJ all the time and say, could you play this? Could you play that? And it's a really fun way to get people involved. But in that instance, the DJ is really in charge of the scenario and can say, great idea, I'll write that down, and can find the right time to weave that song in. So bands and DJs are really good at reading the crowd, knowing what songs are going to really get people onto the dance floor, really knowing how to work with your guests and just get everybody involved and having fun together. And so if you've just got a Spotify playlist playing in the background, it's not the same, and you don't have somebody reading the crowd, knowing what's going to work and make the party really fun. And even if you did have a friend manning the station so that people don't just come up and type in whatever song they want, that person is still not a professional DJ, still not a professional band, able to, make announcements, get people involved, saying, come on everyone, we got, 3 more songs left, get on the dance floor. So this is what you can do instead. I recommend going for the all-inclusive package. And I know what you're saying. You're like, I'm trying to save money here. But this will save you money. If you go for an all-inclusive package where you get a band that comes with a DJ and the sound equipment and the lights and the smoke and all the different things, you're getting all the things that you need for the wedding party, but with the cost of one set of travel costs, setup costs, and everything's included. So you're not having to go and source equipment where somebody has to then bring it in, set it up, and you're paying for their transport and setup time. And then you've got to find, lights, and you've got to get someone else to come and set up the lights. And it's a whole big thing. And then also the stress that's associated with that. One band that comes with a DJ, all the sound equipment, boom, got you. Okay, when it comes to your wedding party, this is the group of people made up of your besties, maybe your siblings. They're the ones who stand with you on the day, celebrating with you, helping you to plan the wedding, making this the best day of your life. And now what can happen is if you want to have all your besties there, and you might be tempted to just put them in the cheapest dresses you can find. And it looks cheap too. So this is what you can do instead. You can get your girls to do each other's hair and makeup. So instead of spending money on everyone's hair, everyone's makeup, they could do their own. This can work really well if you give them enough warning so that they know to, bring the right things like hair straighteners and curling irons. If they bring their makeup things with them, you've got lots of spaces with mirrors and natural light where they can all be helping each other. They could be practicing doing their hair ahead of time. You could offer to buy things like their lipstick and some other makeup products to really help them. But this works well if you communicate ahead of time. You could also ask your bridesmaids to buy their own dresses. Now, what I'm not suggesting is you say, hey, this is the dress I want you to buy. And then you send them a link and expect them to buy it. And you make it expensive. What I'm suggesting is you give them a color palette and a kind of aesthetic that you're going for. And you allow them to choose whatever they want. And then you know that they're going to buy something that fits with the wedding theme. It's in their budget. It's something that they look good in, they feel comfortable in. And ultimately, you'll be happy and so will they. I love that mix and match kind of look. And so I actually did that for my bridesmaids. I had 9 of them. So if they all wore the same thing, it was going to look a bit weird. And I couldn't afford to buy 9 dresses. And so I just said, hey, I'm happy for you to choose what you want to wear. And then you can pick something that's in your budget. You could borrow from someone if you want to. You could wear something you already have if it fits with the aesthetic. I was really relaxed about it. And so I just said to them, we're going for like shades of light pink. So blush pink, light pink, that kind of thing. So slightly different shades. I didn't want them all looking exactly the same. I was also quite happy if they all wore totally different shades of pink, but it just worked out that they all wore different shades of light pink. And it fit really, really nicely together. And so they'd really love you if you did that. Okay, you could also, if you want to give them gifts, you could give them a gift that is something they're actually going to use on the day. So, for example, you could give them their earrings. So it's a lovely gift, but it's also something that they're going to wear at the wedding. I did this for my bridesmaids, but I did say to them ahead of time, what I'd love for you to organize is your own dress. This is what you can, this is the kind of aesthetic you're looking at. Your own shoes, any shoes that are kind of nude, brown, beige, anything like that. And I said, don't worry about your jewelry. And then they knew. And then you can pair the gift with a handwritten note, because there's nothing more special than a thoughtful handwritten note. It doesn't cost you anything to write, and they'll feel really special having that from you, and they can read it then and keep it and treasure it too. Okay, one more, and then we're going to end with some bonus budget tips. When it comes to your wedding venue, okay, you might be toying with the idea of just getting married in your backyard instead, because you might be thinking the wedding venue is just so expensive. And I get it. It is the biggest cost that you're going to be looking at. But if you get married just in your backyard and you kind of make it happen, unless you host weddings in your backyard all the time, it's probably not going to feel like a wedding. So here are some ideas of things you can do instead. You can get married on an off-peak date. So winter dates, midweek dates, those are your off-peak options because they're usually cheaper. So when you're exploring different wedding venues, have an ask, just find out from them what the different package options are. You could pick one venue instead of 2. So now I mentioned before that if you're looking to host loads and loads of guests, having 2 venues is helpful because you have everyone at the ceremony and then some of them move on to the reception. But if your venue is the priority, pick one venue because then it's less transport costs, it's less setup costs, it's one set of flowers. So you're not having all the flowers at the ceremony and then having to have another set at the reception. So in that way, having one venue actually saves you money. You could have bigger tables. So if you're having, let's say, 100 guests, you could have 10 tables of 10 instead of 20 tables of 5, for example. I don't know if people are actually setting up tables of 5, but for lack of giving you incorrect maths, those are my 2 options. But if you have bigger tables, it means you're having less items that are charged per table. So tablecloths, centerpieces, any kind of decor that's at the table, the table numbers, all of that kind of thing. Anything that is per table, if you have bigger tables, you're sorted. And then finally, you can choose a venue that's local to you and most of your guests, and then choose other suppliers that are local to the venue. So you're saving on travel costs for you, for most of your guests. You're not spending as much on travel costs for your suppliers as well. And ultimately, you're saving the planet in doing so. Okay, I'm going to end with some bonus wedding tips. If you are really worried about spending money on your wedding and you just don't know how you're going to afford it, here are 3 tips to help you. Tip number 1, create a wedding budget and actually stick to it. Because if you don't have a budget, you're really just guessing. But having a budget means you know what numbers you're working with, and you need to use a spreadsheet or a budget tracker or receipts and invoices, any system that works for you to help you keep track of what you've been quoted and what you've actually spent and then what you have left. Tip number 2, focus on the elements that are important to you and ditch the rest. So if the party is important to you, focus on that. If the food is important to you, focus on that. If having loads of guests is important to you, focus on that. Whatever the thing is, that's your focus. And then the rest of the items, you then need to make a compromise. So sit down with your partner, work out what is your priority together, and that's what your financial focus should be on first. And finally, resist the urge to DIY everything. Sure, DIYing is the best option for some couples with some things, but I always recommend that you do your research first. If you've never done a DIY project in your life, I wouldn't attempt to do anything for the wedding. But if you like DIY, Pick one or two things. Don't be that person that makes their own dress, bakes their own cake, makes their own bouquets, creates all the centerpieces, makes the table plan, and tries to do everything, because you're going to be stressed. It's probably going to cost you more in terms of your time, and you're going to spend more money on the resources that you need to make everything, and it may end up being more expensive than just getting a professional. So pick the DIY projects that you want to do, pick them wisely, make sure that you have the resources to actually do them, and then leave the rest up to the pros. Well, thank you for listening today. The Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online podcast is produced by me, Kelly, and mixed, mastered, and edited by Glenn Hartman. For more wedding planning tips, advice, checklists, and more, visit weddingsonline.ie.